Murder at the Sunday church service. A Miss Marple mystery. Welcome to Mystery Crackers. I'm Michael, your host for tonight's Miss Marple mystery. It's always a pleasure to have you here. Before we begin, I'd love to know what's something you've always been curious about. A small habit people have, a place you've never been, or even a mystery that stayed with you for years. Share it with us in the comments. I truly enjoy reading your thoughts. Now then, settle in, and let's begin tonight's story. Chapter 1. The village of St. Mary's lay still beneath a grey, overcast sky, a picture of peaceful English serenity. Its cobbled streets and ivy-clad cottages could have been lifted from a postcard, where time seemed to linger, and the rhythm of life moved at the pace of the seasons. On this particular Sunday, the village's quaintness seemed even more pronounced, as the villagers gathered at St. Mary's Church for the morning service, a ritual as constant and comforting as the ticking of the church clock. Miss Marple stood at the corner of the churchyard, her cane tapping softly against the stone path as she surveyed the scene. She had come to church not for the sermon, but for the comfort of routine, the gentle hum of community, and, of course, the opportunity to observe. At her age, it was difficult to remain entirely invisible, but she was always keenly aware of the undercurrents of the village's social life, those small details that spoke volumes. The congregation was gathered in the churchyard, chatting in the cool morning air before making their way inside. The women exchanged polite pleasantries, their voices carrying a tone of rehearsed civility, while the men discussed the latest news, in a manner that suggested they had little interest in what was being said. It was the same every week, the mundane and the unspoken, the delicate balance of village life maintained by layers of courtesy and subtle glances. At the edge of the crowd, Miss Marple noticed Mrs. Henshaw, the widow who had recently moved to St. Mary's, standing a little too far apart from the others. Her hands clasped tightly before her gave away an unease Miss Marple had seen too many times before. Mrs. Henshaw had come to the village with a heavy air about her, one that suggested a burden she was trying to leave behind. But Miss Marple knew better than to ignore such things. People, after all, could only hide so much. As the bell tolled, announcing the start of the service, Miss Marple stepped slowly toward the church, her eyes catching small details. The way Mr. Dawson shifted uncomfortably when Mrs. Jenkins greeted him, the slight twitch in Mrs. Barrett's mouth as she nodded at the young curate, the hurried movements of the vicar as he entered the church with a furrowed brow. They were all hiding something, Miss Marple was certain of it. Inside the church, the scent of aged wood and incense filled the air as the congregation settled into their pews. Miss Marple chose her usual seat at the back, where she could observe everything without being noticed. The choir sang with enthusiasm. The organ played with solemnity, but Miss Marple's attention was not on the hymns. She watched the faces of the villagers as they sat in quiet contemplation. The way their eyes darted from one person to another, the small, nervous gestures, the way some of them would glance toward the back of the church, as if expecting someone or something to appear. Her attention was momentarily drawn to the altar, where the vicar stood, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted the cloth covering the chalice. He had always been a man of few words, but Miss Marple could tell there was more to his discomfort than the usual nerves before a service. A small but significant detail had caught her eye. The way his fingers lingered over the edge of the chalice, as though hesitant to touch it. The service continued without incident, but Miss Marple could not shake the feeling that something was wrong. It was a sensation she had learned to trust over the years. An intuition honed by years of observing the people around her. The small village of St. Mary's, so seemingly ordinary, had a rhythm, a pattern, and it was a pattern that had been disrupted. As the final hymn was sung, and the congregation began to file out of the church, Miss Marple's thoughts were already turning. There was a tension in the air, something beneath the surface that threatened to break free. She had seen this before. Perhaps in the coming days, the veil of normalcy would be lifted, and the truth would reveal itself in its own time. But for now, Miss Marple would return home, her mind already sifting through the details of the morning, knowing full well that the village was on the brink of something far more troubling than anyone could imagine. Chapter 2. The morning after the church service, the village of St. Mary's awoke to the same quiet charm it had always known, but this time there was something unsettling in the air. The day unfolded as normal, with children playing in the square, the baker pulling fresh loaves from the oven, and the postman trudging along his usual route. Yet a subtle tension clung to the streets, a dissonant note in an otherwise perfect melody. Miss Marple, seated in her favourite armchair by the window, was embroidering, a task that allowed her to occupy her hands while her mind remained free to wander. Her thoughts drifted back to the church service, to the small details she had noticed in the faces of the villagers. The brief glance exchanged between Mrs. Henshaw and the vicar, the nervous twitch of Mr. Dawson's eye, the strange silence that fell when the subject of the missing heirloom came up in the pew. As the clock struck 10, Miss Marple was interrupted by the sound of hurried footsteps outside her window. A figure appeared at her door, breathing heavily, as if he had run all the way from the church. "Miss Marple, it's dreadful!" cried Inspector Fawcett, his usually composed demeanour now frayed with visible concern. "A murder! A murder in the church!" Her needle hovered above the fabric for a moment, the thread caught in mid-air. "Murder, you say?" she asked, her voice calm, betraying no surprise. "How curious!" Fawcett glanced around the room, as though the walls themselves might offer some answer. "I came straight to you. We've found the body. It's the vicar, Miss Marple." At that, Miss Marple set down her embroidery. The news struck her not like a sudden shock, but with a deep, familiar resonance, as though a puzzle piece she hadn't yet identified had just clicked into place. She stood, smoothing her dress as she composed herself, then turned her attention to the young officer at Fawcett's side, who had been waiting in silence. "Tell me," Miss Marple said, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Where was he found?" Fawcett cleared his throat. "In the vestry, just behind the altar. It looks like he collapsed while preparing for his sermon. We're not sure yet if it was poison or something else, but the signs point to foul play. He had no enemies, at least none that we know of. Everyone says he was a quiet, unassuming man." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her mind already beginning to work. "The question, Inspector, is not who would harm him, but who would gain from his harm." With a curt nod, Fawcett signalled for the officer to step back. "I'll have the body moved to the mortuary for further investigation. I can't make sense of it, Miss Marple. It's all too sudden, too clean. The vicar was well liked. He had no quarrels with anyone." Miss Marple's eyes drifted toward the window again. The morning light outside seemed to carry an unusual stillness, as though the village itself was holding its breath. "Perhaps," Miss Marple murmured, "there is more to be found in the way people react to this tragedy than in the tragedy itself." The inspector looked at her with a frown. then took a step toward the door. "I'll keep you informed, Miss Marple. We'll be questioning everyone from the church, the congregation, the staff, anyone who had contact with the vicar." Miss Marple's mind was already racing ahead. She knew that in any village, the story was never as simple as it appeared. People's lives were always tangled in ways that only time, sometimes only tragedy, could untangle. And as the inspector departed, Miss Marple felt a faint stir in her chest, the whisper of something she couldn't yet name. The day dragged on with an odd quietness, but by late afternoon, the first ripples of gossip had already begun to spread through St. Mary's. Miss Marple, having changed into her light grey walking coat, ventured toward the village square. The old stone streets were unusually empty, the usual bustle replaced by hushed voices and sidelong glances. Word of the vicar's death had spread quickly. At the corner of the square, Miss Marple noticed Mrs. Henshaw standing alone, her face pale and drawn. The widow's eyes flickered toward Miss Marple for only a moment before she quickly looked away. Miss Marple, ever observant, noted the change in her demeanour. Mrs. Henshaw had not been present at the church this morning. Miss Marple had not seen her during the service. Had she known something? Miss Marple's gaze turned to the vicar's assistant, a young man named James who was standing near the post office. His posture was stiff, his eyes darting nervously toward the square. James had always seemed harmless enough, but something about him now seemed different. He was clutching a book to his chest, his knuckles white with tension. "Miss Marple," he said in a voice that trembled just a touch too much for casual greeting, "I didn't expect to see you out today. It's all rather dreadful, isn't it?" "I dare say it is," Miss Marple replied. She noted the book he held, an old Bible, the edges worn. It seemed out of place for a young man, especially one who had always been so keen to avoid such things. She wondered what had changed in the last 24 hours to make him hold it so tightly. As she turned to leave, a slight shiver passed down her spine. Something about this young man didn't sit right with her, but it was a feeling that wasn't yet fully formed, more an impression than a conclusion. By nightfall, the village had shifted in ways that were almost imperceptible. The threat of a hidden danger hung over the village like an unsung song, and Miss Marple could feel it in her bones. There was no panic, no overt signs of suspicion, but an undercurrent of unease rippled beneath the surface of ordinary village life. In her sitting room, Miss Marple sat quietly by the fire, her mind turning over the new information that had been gathered. The vicar was dead, and no one had seen it coming. But that, Miss Marple knew, was always the way with a well-hidden crime. Nothing ever seemed out of place until you looked closely. And as always, Miss Marple was prepared to look closely. Chapter 3. The days following the vicar's sudden death unfolded as they always did in St. Mary's, quiet, almost unnervingly so. The village settled into a pattern of subdued conversations, stolen glances, and hushed whispers. Everyone seemed to wait, uncertain of the next turn in the investigation, and Miss Marple, with her practised calm, allowed the events to wash over her, always keenly aware of the smallest detail. The following morning, Miss Marple made her way to the churchyard once more. The service had been suspended in the wake of the vicar's death, but there was still a sombre, quiet air hanging over the old building. The church itself, normally a place of refuge and comfort, now seemed a little more imposing, its stone walls heavy with silence. Inspector Fawcett, who had been pacing in front of the church doors when Miss Marple arrived, looked up as she approached. His face, usually confident and composed, was drawn tight with frustration. "Good morning, Miss Marple. Well, I'm afraid the situation isn't any clearer." Miss Marple glanced at him, offering a small, knowing smile. "You're not any closer to the truth, then?" "Not yet, but we have a suspect," he said, his voice laced with uncertainty. "It's James, the vicar's assistant." At the mention of James, Miss Marple's interest piqued. She had, after all, noticed his odd behaviour the day before. But she remained silent, waiting for Fawcett to continue. "We found something," Fawcett explained, his eyes narrowing as he lowered his voice. "A letter, hidden in James's room. It's addressed to the vicar, or rather it was supposed to be. But there's a confession in it, something about money, debts. It seems that the vicar had been helping him, but James, he didn't take kindly to the idea of being indebted." "And yet," Miss Marple observed, "you're sure it was James who wrote it?" "Not absolutely," Fawcett admitted, "but it certainly looks like it. The handwriting matches what we've seen on other notes, and the contents," he trailed off, clearly disturbed by what he had read. "There's mention of a financial struggle, of threats. James's father had debts, and the vicar had promised to help pay them off. But if James had a reason to stop that help—" He didn't finish the thought, but the implication was clear. Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "You believe that James might have killed the vicar over money?" "It's the simplest explanation," Fawcett said, his voice heavy. "A desperate man, pushed to his limit." Miss Marple nodded slowly, her fingers lightly tapping the handle of her cane. "Perhaps, but as you know, the simplest explanation is not always the right one. Tell me, Inspector, how did James act when he found out about the vicar's death?" Fawcett paused, clearly trying to recall the moment. "Oddly enough, he didn't react much at all. When I told him, he went pale, but he didn't seem overly shocked. I thought that might be strange, considering how close they'd been. But then again—" He trailed off again, looking away as if reconsidering his previous certainty. "Did he show any other signs?" Miss Marple pressed gently. "Any nervous gestures, contradictions in his story?" Fawcett hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Yes, there was something. When I asked him where he'd been last night, he said he'd been in the vicarage all evening reading. But I later spoke to Mrs. Jenkins, she's the housekeeper, and she said James left just after supper. She couldn't say where he went, but she did mention that he came back late. Very late. Interesting," Miss Marple said, her tone quiet. "I do hope, Inspector, that you're not rushing to conclusions. James might be involved, but we mustn't overlook anything." Fawcett looked at her, the frustration in his eyes giving way to a hint of doubt. "I know you're right, Miss Marple, but something about this feels off." That afternoon, Miss Marple visited Mrs. Jenkins at the vicarage, hoping to glean more information about James's behaviour and his movements. Mrs. Jenkins, a stout woman with a no-nonsense demeanour, greeted Miss Marple with a cordial but wary look. The housekeeper had always been a bit reserved, and she seemed even more so today. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Jenkins," Miss Marple said kindly. "I do hope you're managing well under the circumstances." Mrs. Jenkins nodded, her hands wringing the apron she wore. "It's been a dreadful shock, Miss Marple. The vicar's such a good man. I don't know what to think any more." "I'm sure it's difficult," Miss Marple replied, her voice gentle. "I was hoping you could tell me about James. He's been quite a figure of interest in the investigation, and I understand he might have been close to the vicar." Mrs. Jenkins stiffened at the mention of James's name. "Close?" she repeated with a frown. "Well, yes, he worked for the vicar. but I wouldn't say they were close, not in the way you mean. He's a quiet boy, kept to himself mostly. Though he did seem upset recently, especially about the debts his father left behind. Did he ever talk about those debts with the vicar? Miss Marple asked, her tone casual, though her eyes were keen. Mrs. Jenkins hesitated. I wouldn't know about that. But there were times when the vicar and James would argue, quiet-like. Not enough for anyone to hear, but you could see it in James's face. Did they argue about money? Miss Marple's voice was barely above a whisper. Yes, Mrs. Jenkins admitted softly, her gaze dropping to the floor. The vicar promised to help, but James was proud. He didn't want anyone to know his family's troubles. I think he resented the help. Miss Marple gave a slight nod, her mind churning with the possibilities. The young man's pride, his mounting debts, and his volatile emotions were all telling pieces. But something still didn't fit. If James was the killer, why had he not reacted more strongly to the vicar's death? Why had he been so eerily composed? As Miss Marple prepared to leave, she glanced at the doorway where James had been standing only a moment before. She had caught a glimpse of something in his eyes. A shadow of guilt, yes, but also something else. Fear. Fear of being discovered, perhaps, but also something more primal. Fear of losing control. Chapter 4. Miss Marple returned home from the vicarage, the weight of the conversation lingering in her thoughts. James had appeared so composed in Mrs. Jenkins's presence, but there was an unmistakable flicker in his eyes, a combination of guilt and something far more unsettling. She had noted it before when he had greeted her in the village square. But now her suspicions were growing. Could he have killed the vicar? Or was there another layer to this mystery waiting to be uncovered? The evening had arrived quietly in St. Mary's, the setting sun casting long shadows over the cobblestone streets. The villagers, in their usual manner, tried to carry on with their daily routines, but the death of the vicar had unsettled everyone. Miss Marple noticed it in their behaviour. The hurried steps, the eyes that darted away when caught in conversation, the awkward silences where there had once been comfort. It was as though the fabric of their lives had been torn, and no one knew how to stitch it back together. As Miss Marple sat by her fireplace that evening, the glow of the flames casting a soft light in the room, her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. The inspector had said he would keep her informed, but it was still a surprise to see him at this hour. Miss Marple, Inspector Fawcett said, his voice carrying a note of urgency as he stepped inside. I've just come from the vicarage, and there's something I think you should know. Please, do sit down, Miss Marple said, gesturing to the armchair opposite hers. You look as though you've had a long day. Fawcett accepted her offer and settled into the chair, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. It's James. I don't know how to explain it, but I've just discovered something that changes everything. I think I was wrong to focus on him as our prime suspect. Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. Her interest piqued. You've changed your mind, then? Not exactly, Fawcett replied, rubbing his temple as though the weight of the decision was heavy. I've discovered something about the vicar's financial records. It seems he was planning to make a large donation to the church, but not to the church itself. There's a sum listed in his ledger, a sum that James knew nothing about. It's a sum that the vicar intended to give to someone else. A donation? Miss Marple asked, her fingers drumming lightly on her cane. To whom? Fawcett hesitated, the line of tension deepening between his brows. I've just come from speaking with Mrs. Henshaw." It seems the vicar had been meeting with her regularly, no one knew, not even the church staff. The meetings were private, and she didn't know what the vicar was doing with the money. But the records, Miss Marple, they suggest something more, something deeper. And I think it's possible that this connection might have led to his death. Miss Marple's thoughts raced as she absorbed the new information. Mrs. Henshaw, a woman so new to the village, had never seemed particularly connected to the vicar, at least not in any obvious way. And yet, here she was, linked to a financial mystery that had the potential to unravel everything. "And what of James?" Miss Marple asked. "Where does he fit into all of this?" Fawcett's face darkened. "I've been thinking about that. If James was the one who found out about the vicar's plans, he might have felt betrayed. After all, the vicar had promised to help him and his family, but now this donation, this large sum, was going to someone else. But James didn't react in the way one would expect a guilty man to act," Miss Marple said softly, more to herself than to Fawcett. "And he certainly didn't show the kind of remorse or shock that you'd expect upon hearing of the vicar's death." "Exactly," Fawcett said, his voice rising slightly in frustration. "That's why I'm starting to doubt our initial theory. Something about it feels wrong, but I just don't know what it is." Miss Marple stood up, walking slowly toward the window. The village outside seemed peaceful in the gathering dusk, but she knew better than anyone that beneath the surface of this quiet place, dark secrets lurked. She had always found that the truth was never as simple as it seemed. And now, more than ever, she felt the weight of her responsibility to uncover it. "I think, Inspector, that we need to focus not on the people who were close to the vicar, but on those who were closest to the secrets he was keeping," she said, her voice steady. "You must speak with Mrs. Henshaw again, and this time ask her about her meetings with the vicar. She knows more than she's letting on." The next morning, Inspector Fawcett, having taken Miss Marple's advice to heart, went straight to Mrs. Henshaw's cottage. Miss Marple, meanwhile, had another task in mind. She made her way toward the village hall, where she had overheard a few snippets of gossip the previous day. She had noticed how people had been speaking in lowered voices, always looking over their shoulders before continuing their conversations. There were whispers of past conflicts, of old grievances, and of things left unsaid. As she entered the hall, Miss Marple spotted Mrs. Jenkins at the counter, talking to a group of women from the village. Their conversation paused as Miss Marple approached, and the women straightened, their eyes flickering with a mix of curiosity and wariness. "Good morning, Mrs. Jenkins," Miss Marple greeted her with a warm smile. "I was just wondering if you might have some time to talk. I'm still gathering information about the vicar's passing." The housekeeper nodded, her hands clasping together in front of her. "Of course, Miss Marple. What can I help with?" "Well, for one thing, I'm curious about the vicar's relationship with Mrs. Henshaw," Miss Marple said, her voice casual but pointed. "Do you know if they were close?" Mrs. Jenkins's eyes darted briefly to the other women before she spoke. "Mrs. Henshaw? Oh, she's a quiet one, kept to herself mostly. But I did see her and the vicar talking in the garden once or twice. Never any reason to think anything. Was amiss, though." "Interesting," Miss Marple murmured, her mind working through the possibilities. Mrs. Jenkins's words, though unremarkable at first, seemed to be another small piece in the puzzle. She had seen the two of them speaking in the garden. Had their conversations been innocent, or had they been something far more complex? Chapter 5. The following days brought little relief to the simmering tension in St. Mary's. Inspector Fawcett, still weighing his options and consulting with his officers, found his thoughts tangled in the web of contradictions that had emerged. Meanwhile, Miss Marple's mind was ever active, considering every word, every look, and every gesture that might offer a clue about the true cause of the vicar's death. On a particularly crisp morning, Miss Marple found herself once again at the church. She had walked past the doors earlier in the day, her attention momentarily caught by the workman replacing the damaged glass in one of the windows. It was a scene that for most would have seemed completely ordinary, but Miss Marple was drawn to something about the workers' behaviour, the manner in which they hurried to finish their task, and the tension that hung in the air. It was subtle, but it did not escape her notice. They were working faster than necessary, perhaps anxious to avoid being seen by someone, or perhaps by something. She took a deep breath, approaching the open doors with deliberate steps, her eyes scanning the area. The church, now deserted, was quiet, save for the echo of her footsteps across the stone floor. She stopped near the altar, pausing to observe the spot where the vicar's body had been found. Her gaze shifted to the pews, where the villagers had sat in mourning just days before. Something felt off. A nagging sensation tugged at the edge of her mind, but she couldn't place it yet. It wasn't until she noticed the discarded piece of paper, half hidden beneath a pew near the back, that the pieces began to fall into place. With careful fingers, Miss Marple picked it up and unfolded it, smoothing out the creases. The letter was hastily written in pencil, the handwriting shaky but legible. As her eyes scanned the words, she felt a prickling of recognition, though she couldn't immediately place the name. To the one who holds my secret, I will not be silenced. If I must, I will expose all, and the consequences will be dire. I only pray it doesn't come to that. Please reconsider. Miss Marple's heart quickened slightly, and she scanned the rest of the paper, but there was no signature, no indication of the sender or recipient, only an overwhelming sense of urgency and fear. She folded the letter carefully, slipping it into her coat pocket. For a moment, she simply stood still, reflecting on the words. The letter had clearly been intended for someone who had been in the vicar's life recently enough to have caused a rift. The lack of a signature told her that whoever had written it was not just worried about the vicar's intentions, but deeply afraid of what might happen if this secret were revealed. It seemed to confirm the idea she had been toying with. There was something much more complicated behind the vicar's death than money, and Mrs. Henshaw's involvement had grown murkier by the day. Later that day, Miss Marple called on Inspector Fawcett. His brow furrowed when he saw her, but he greeted her with the professional politeness she had come to expect. She wasted no time in presenting the letter she had found. "I think you'll find this quite revealing," Miss Marple said, her voice calm but deliberate as she handed him the folded paper. "It was discarded in the church, hidden behind a pew." Fawcett unfolded the letter, his eyes scanning it carefully. He read it twice before looking up at Miss Marple, his expression shifting from confusion to realization. This changes everything, but it doesn't make sense. Who could have sent it? Who indeed? Miss Marple replied. It seems that the vicar was hiding something from someone, a secret perhaps, that would have caused trouble if it were exposed. And judging by the tone of the letter, I believe that it was a secret worth killing for. Fawcett's gaze grew sharp. "But how does this connect with Mrs. Henshaw? I was under the impression that the two of them had some sort of arrangement. You said she was involved with him financially. Is this a part of that?" Miss Marple shook her head slowly. "I don't think so. Mrs. Henshaw may have been the vicar's confidant, but I suspect her involvement is more complex than just financial. This letter suggests something darker, a threat of exposure. Someone else may have been behind the vicar's death, someone who didn't want their secrets exposed." "Could it be James?" Fawcett asked, his tone tentative. "Could this be a result of the vicar's promise to help him with his debts?" Miss Marple considered the possibility, but dismissed it. "I don't believe so. James's motives were clear. He wanted the vicar's help. But this letter is different. It speaks to a fear of exposure, a fear that the vicar's secrets could ruin someone. The timing of the letter, the language, it all suggests that someone was trying to stop the vicar from revealing something much more damaging than any financial dispute." Fawcett's eyes narrowed as he thought through the implications. "So, we're looking for someone who had something to lose, someone whose actions had been hidden for a long time." Miss Marple nodded. "Precisely. And I think that person may be much closer to the vicar than anyone has realized." As Miss Marple left the inspector's office, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was finally getting closer to the truth. The letter was just one piece of the puzzle, but it was a significant one. Whoever had written it had been "Igagine desperate," and their actions had set off a chain of events that led to the vicar's death. She spent the rest of the afternoon reflecting on the letter and what it revealed: an undisclosed secret, hidden alliances, and someone willing to do whatever it took to keep their past buried. The village of St. Mary's, with all its gossip and hidden tensions, was beginning to unravel. But Miss Marple knew there was still much more to uncover. Chapter 6. The days that followed the discovery of the letter were a blur of activity and thought for Miss Marple. Her mind, ever attuned to the smallest of details, found itself drawn into a complex web of relationships, secrets and lies that had been carefully woven within the village of St. Mary's for years. There was more at play here than the simple death of a vicar, and Miss Marple was determined to unravel it, piece by piece. Inspector Fawcett had been busy since their last meeting, re-examining the evidence and the witnesses. Despite his initial conviction about James's involvement, he now appeared less certain, the letter having thrown his theories into doubt. But Miss Marple knew that it wasn't just the letter that would solve the mystery. It was the context behind it. There were connections here that even Fawcett hadn't yet considered, and it was these connections that Miss Marple needed to examine. It was late afternoon when Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor. Mrs. Henshaw stood at her door, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and determination. "Miss Marple, I must speak with you," Mrs. Henshaw said, her voice trembling. "There are things I haven't told anyone, things that I must confess before it's too late." Miss Marple stepped aside, gesturing for Mrs. Henshaw to enter. "Please, sit down, Mrs. Henshaw. You're clearly troubled." The widow took a deep breath, her hands clutching the hem of her shawl. "It's about the vicar, about what he knew, about what he was planning. He was going to reveal something, Miss Marple, something that would destroy me if it ever came to light." Miss Marple's eyes softened with understanding. "You were close to the vicar, were you not?" Mrs. Henshaw nodded, her gaze dropping to her hands. Yes, we were close, but it was never what people thought. We were friends, but I didn't want anyone to know how close we were. I didn't want them to know what he had promised me." "What had he promised you?" Miss Marple asked gently, though she already had a suspicion. Mrs. Henshaw hesitated, then leaned forward, her voice barely a whisper. "He promised to keep my secret, Miss Marple. The secret of my past, my first husband. He wasn't what I had told anyone. He wasn't a simple merchant. He was involved in things that were illegal, dangerous even, and the vicar knew. He found out when he was going through old records, and he insisted on helping me. He wanted to protect me, but he was worried. He was worried that someone else might find out. Someone who would use that knowledge to harm me." Miss Marple's mind raced as she processed Mrs. Henshaw's confession. This was the key, she realized. The vicar had been trying to protect her, but he had also been threatened by someone who wanted to ensure that the truth about Mrs. Henshaw's past never saw the light of day. "Who else knew Mrs. Henshaw?" Miss Marple asked softly, her gaze intense. "Who else was involved in this?" Tears welled in Mrs. Henshaw's eyes as she shook her head. "No one. Only the vicar knew. But I overheard him speaking to someone the night before he died. He was worried about a letter that was going to be delivered to someone. I didn't know who it was for, but I heard him mention the name James." At the mention of James's name, Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat. James had been the vicar's assistant, but he also had his own set of troubles. Could James have been involved in this tangled mess of secrets and fear? Had the vicar known too much and been in danger of exposing James's connection to Mrs. Henshaw? "James," Miss Marple repeated slowly. "Did the vicar tell you anything else?" "No," Mrs. Henshaw whispered, "but he sounded so afraid. He said that if he didn't get the letter to the right person, there would be trouble. I didn't know what he meant, but I should have. I should have done something." Miss Marple sat back in her chair, considering Mrs. Henshaw's words carefully. The timing of the vicar's fear, his conversation with Mrs. Henshaw, and the letter all pointed to a larger conspiracy. Miss Marple had already suspected that the death of the vicar had something to do with a secret he was protecting, but now she could see that it was far more intricate than she had imagined. The next morning, Miss Marple decided to visit the church once more. It was clear that James was at the heart of the mystery, but she needed to understand more about his relationship with the vicar and what role he had played in the days leading up to the murder. The church was quiet, its pews empty, but the atmosphere inside was heavy with the residue of grief and uncertainty. As Miss Marple walked toward the altar, she noticed a figure standing near the back, a young man slightly hunched, as though he were trying to remain unnoticed. It was James. Miss Marple approached him with her usual calm, her eyes focused but not overtly accusatory. "Good morning, James," she said gently. "I hope you're holding up well during this difficult time." James turned, startled, but quickly masked his surprise with a forced smile. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice tight, "I wasn't expecting to see you here." "I often find myself in places I'm not expected," Miss Marple replied, her tone light but her gaze sharp. "And I do hope you're well, considering everything." He stiffened at her words, but he nodded. "I'm fine. Just, it's been hard, you know. The vicar, he was like a father to me. I don't know how to go on without him." Miss Marple studied him for a moment, noting the tension in his posture. "I'm sure it's been difficult, but I imagine you're also troubled by the circumstances of his death." James's eyes darted away briefly before he answered, "Of course, we all are, but what's done is done." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "It's never just done, James. You might find in time that there are things left undone, things that need to be brought into the light." He flinched at her words, his discomfort palpable. Miss Marple could see the cracks in his facade, the nervous energy that betrayed his calm exterior. As she turned to leave, her mind was already working through the implications. James's unease, Mrs. Henshaw's confession, the vicar's last moments, there was a story here. A story that Miss Marple was determined to uncover, no matter how many hidden motives or secrets stood in her way. Chapter 7. The days following her conversation with James brought Miss Marple no closer to an immediate conclusion, but she had, in her quiet way, begun to see the faint outlines of a much larger picture. The more she pieced together the statements of the villagers, the more certain she became that the true culprit was someone hidden in plain sight. It was never the obvious suspects that Miss Marple had to worry about, but rather those whose lives were so wrapped up in mystery that they seemed almost invisible to others. The village had been buzzing ever since the vicar's death, but now it seemed that the real focus of attention was on Mrs. Henshaw. Her tearful confession to Miss Marple had set in motion a cascade of new questions. The widow, who had previously been thought of as little more than a lonely new arrival, now stood at the centre of a conspiracy much larger than anyone had imagined. The letter that had been discovered, the mention of debts, and the unspoken connection between her and the vicar all pointed towards something deeper than a simple act of revenge. It wasn't just the vicar's life that had been at risk. It was his attempts to protect someone else, someone who had far more to lose. Miss Marple sat by the fire in her modest sitting room, a cup of tea in hand, as she mulled over her thoughts. The room was quiet, the only sound the faint crackling of the fire and the distant call of a bird outside. She had spent the morning visiting the village shop and overhearing snippets of conversation. There was no real clarity, only speculation, but there was something in the air, an unspoken tension among the villagers that seemed to point toward a deeper understanding. The door creaked open, and Miss Marple looked up to see Inspector Fawcett standing in the doorway. His face was grim, but there was a glimmer of resolve in his eyes. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him. With a soft click, "Miss Marple," he began, his tone weighted. "I've been going over the statements again. You were right, there's more to this than meets the eye." Miss Marple nodded, her gaze steady as she placed the teacup down. "I believe so. You've come to the same conclusion I have, haven't you?" Fawcett hesitated for a moment before sitting down opposite her. "I've been looking into Mrs. Henshaw's past, and there's something you need to know. Her first husband, the one she claimed was just a simple merchant. It turns out he had ties to something much more sinister. I found records that link him to a network of underground trading, illegal dealings in rare artifacts, things that would have been worth a fortune on the black market." Miss Marple's brow furrowed. This was a revelation she hadn't expected, but it only served to strengthen her suspicions. "So the vicar knew about this, and that's why he was trying to protect her?" "Yes," Fawcett said with a sigh. "It appears the vicar had been helping her keep this past hidden. He even went as far as to research it, hoping to erase any traces of her husband's activities." The vicar had been working with someone from outside the village to help Mrs. Henshaw keep this secret buried. So the vicar wasn't just protecting Mrs. Henshaw from public disgrace, Miss Marple mused. He was also protecting her from someone who might use this knowledge against her, someone who could be dangerous. Fawcett nodded gravely. Exactly, and it seems that person might have been closer than we realized. Miss Marple's mind raced as she tried to fit the pieces together. Mrs. Henshaw, the vicar's efforts to shield her, the mysterious letter. There was a connection there, but it still wasn't clear who would go so far as to kill to protect that secret. As Fawcett continued to fill in the blanks about Mrs. Henshaw's history, Miss Marple found herself recalling the small details she had picked up in the past few days. The subtle shifts in people's behavior, the small hesitations and the nervous glances that had lingered far too long. She began to think about James once again, and how his actions had seemed almost too controlled, too self-aware. Had he been involved in this hidden network? Had he been more than just a troubled young man working for the vicar? "Inspector," Miss Marple said suddenly, breaking Fawcett's train of thought. What if the key to this whole mystery isn't just the people around Mrs. Henshaw, but the people who have been hiding in plain sight? Fawcett looked at her, confused. "What do you mean?" "James," Miss Marple replied softly, her voice steady. "I believe James is more deeply involved in this than we've realized. It's not just his family's debts or the vicar's promises to help him. It's something much more dangerous, something tied to Mrs. Henshaw's past." Fawcett's eyes widened in realization. "You think James is connected to her husband's illegal activities?" "I do," Miss Marple confirmed, "but not in the way we thought. He's likely involved in the underground network himself. The vicar's attempt to keep him out of trouble may have been part of a much bigger scheme. James may have been using his position at the vicarage to gather information, maybe even to silence the vicar before the truth came out." Fawcett stood up abruptly, his eyes now filled with determination. "I'll need to speak to James again. There's something I missed in our earlier conversations. If he's been involved in this network, he won't have been acting alone." "I agree," Miss Marple said, rising from her chair. "But remember, Inspector, James may not be the mastermind. He may just be a pawn in a much larger game." The evening passed slowly, the tension building as Miss Marple waited for Fawcett's return. She could feel that the mystery was beginning to unravel, slowly but surely. Each new piece of information pointed toward a network of deception, a hidden world that had been operating beneath the surface of the seemingly peaceful village. Miss Marple's instincts had never been sharper, and she knew that the final truth was within reach. She had always trusted that in the end, the smallest of details would reveal the greatest truths. And now, it seemed that the time had come for those truths to emerge. Chapter 8. The morning light filtered through the drawn curtains of Miss Marple's sitting room as she sat, waiting. The events of the past few days had pulled her further into the depths of a tangled conspiracy, and though she could feel the pieces finally falling into place, the true motives behind the vicar's death were still shrouded in secrecy. Inspector Fawcett had promised to return after another round of questioning, but Miss Marple had a quiet certainty in her that he would need guidance. She had grown accustomed to reading people, to discerning what they were not saying just as much as what they were. And she knew that the final revelation was close. The truth, though, was always more complicated than the sum of its parts. It was in the subtle twists, the contradictions, and the things hidden in plain sight. Fawcett arrived shortly after midday, his face tight with exhaustion, but his steps quickened as he entered. He had clearly been to the church again, judging by the dust on his boots and the strain around his eyes. "Miss Marple," he began, his voice hoarse, "I've spoken to James again. He admitted to knowing about the vicar's investigation into Mrs. Henshaw's past, but he denied having any involvement in the murder. I can tell you, though, he's hiding something." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied, her voice calm but sharp. "I don't believe for a moment that James is innocent, but I also don't think he's the person we should be looking for." Fawcett's brow furrowed, his expression unreadable. "What do you mean? If not James, then who?" Miss Marple paused, considering her next words carefully. "I think the true mastermind is someone far closer to the vicar's death than we realized. Someone who had a much stronger motive than just financial or personal gain. James, for all his faults, was just a pawn. The real culprit is someone who has been hiding in plain sight. Someone whose interests are far more dangerous than anyone had suspected." Fawcett looked at her, clearly unsure. "You're talking about Mrs. Henshaw?" "No," Miss Marple said slowly. "Not Mrs. Henshaw. Think about it, Inspector. Mrs. Henshaw had a secret, certainly, but the vicar was trying to protect her. What if the person who killed him wasn't just concerned with protecting their own interests, but with preventing someone else from exposing their deepest secrets?" Fawcett's eyes widened. "You're not suggesting I am," Miss Marple replied quietly. "I believe the one who killed the vicar is someone who was involved in the network Mrs. Henshaw's late husband had been running. A network that included illegal activities, a dangerous web of corruption that reached far beyond the village of St. Mary's." Miss Marple's words hung in the air, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The weight of the accusation was heavy, but Miss Marple felt a strange clarity as the pieces clicked into place. Fawcett paced around the room, his boots scuffing against the floor as he thought aloud. That would explain the secrecy. The vicar wasn't just protecting Mrs. Henshaw's reputation. He was also trying to prevent something much worse from coming to light. But who would have the means and the motive to silence him? "I think it's someone who had more to lose than anyone else in this village," Miss Marple said softly, her gaze fixed on the window. "Someone who could not afford for the truth to emerge." A long silence followed as Fawcett ran over the names in his mind. Miss Marple watched him, knowing that the breakthrough was close. Suddenly, the inspector stopped pacing, his face lighting up with realization. "James's father," Fawcett muttered, almost to himself. "Of course, he was deeply involved in those illegal dealings, but his death, it all makes sense now. James, as a young man, could have been groomed to take over. If the vicar had discovered that link, if James had been involved with the same people—" Miss Marple nodded slowly, confirming the thought. "James is the link, but not the killer. The vicar discovered something too dangerous to let James take the fall for. The real killer wanted to protect their involvement in the underground dealings. They wanted to silence the vicar and make sure he couldn't expose everything." The weight of Miss Marple's words was enough to make Fawcett's face turn pale. "But who could it be?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Miss Marple didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stood and walked toward the door, her mind sharp and focused. "You've already spoken to Mrs. Henshaw, haven't you, Inspector? You've seen her reactions. What was her reaction when she found out the vicar was dead?" Fawcett hesitated, recalling his previous interactions. She seemed genuinely shocked. But there was something else, something just beneath the surface. Almost as if she knew something she wasn't willing to share. She was afraid. Afraid, Miss Marple repeated softly. That's the key. She was afraid of the very thing the vicar had been trying to protect her from. The truth about her late husband's dealings. As they arrived at Mrs. Henshaw's cottage, the air around them felt charged, the weight of the impending revelation heavy between them. Mrs. Henshaw was sitting by the window when they entered, her eyes downcast, her face pale and worn from sleepless nights. "I know why you're here," she said quietly, her voice almost a whisper. "You've come to ask about the vicar." Miss Marple studied her, her gaze unwavering. "Yes, Mrs. Henshaw. We know that the vicar was trying to protect you, but there is more to this than simple protection. The vicar's death wasn't just about your secret. It was about a much larger web of deception." Tears welled in Mrs. Henshaw's eyes as she met Miss Marple's gaze. "I never wanted any of this," she whispered, her voice cracking. "But I feared for my son's life. I feared for all of our lives. She faltered, the weight of her confession pressing down on her. "James is involved in something far more dangerous than you realize. And when the vicar found out, it was too late. The truth couldn't be hidden any longer." Chapter 9. The silence in Mrs. Henshaw's cottage seemed to stretch on forever, as Miss Marple studied the woman before her. The weight of Mrs. Henshaw's words hung heavy in the room, and despite the sobs that racked her frame, there was a sense of resolution in her eyes. She had finally admitted the truth Miss Marple had suspected all along. But it was still incomplete. There was one final piece to the puzzle that needed to be uncovered. Miss Marple's gaze softened, her voice calm and measured. "You've been carrying this burden for a long time, Mrs. Henshaw. But the vicar was trying to help you, wasn't he? He found out about James, and he wanted to protect both you and your son from what he had discovered." Mrs. Henshaw wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, nodding. "Yes, he was the only one who knew the whole truth. He found the records. James's father had been involved in far worse things than I had ever let on. I thought I could protect my son, but when the vicar found out about the network James was becoming a part of, well, it was too late. He'd already gotten too deep." "Too deep into what?" Miss Marple asked, softly, her voice gentle but insistent. "What is it that James was involved in?" Mrs. Henshaw hesitated for a long moment, the fear still clear in her eyes. "He was involved in smuggling, Miss Marple. Smuggling rare artifacts. My late husband, had been part of a network that moved stolen goods through the country. They'd planned to use the vicar's reputation to launder their business through his charitable donations, and when the vicar refused, they saw him as a threat." "James was part of that network?" Fawcett asked, his voice laced with disbelief. He had been standing by the door, listening intently, but he now moved closer to Mrs. Henshaw. "Yes," she whispered, her voice breaking. "James, he was being groomed by some of his father's associates. He didn't want to be part of it, but he was. And when the vicar threatened to expose everything, James was caught between loyalty to his father's past and the vicar's desire to protect him. That's when it all became too much." Miss Marple's eyes moved thoughtfully toward the window as she processed the new information. She had suspected that James's involvement wasn't purely out of financial desperation, but the truth was even darker than she had anticipated. James had been tangled in a network of criminal activity that stretched far beyond what the villagers could have imagined. "What happened that night?" Miss Marple asked, turning back toward Mrs. Henshaw. "What did James do when he found out the vicar was going to reveal everything?" Mrs. Henshaw's face tightened with guilt. James knew the vicar was going to expose him, his father's past and his own involvement. But it wasn't just about saving himself. It was about protecting the people who would come after him. He couldn't let the vicar destroy everything. So, he killed the vicar, Miss Marple said, her voice steady but tinged with sadness. He had no choice in his mind, or so he thought. Mrs. Henshaw nodded, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. He was desperate, Miss Marple. He never wanted to harm anyone, but the fear of being exposed, it drove him to make that terrible decision. Fawcett's face twisted with a mix of frustration and disbelief. But James admitted to nothing. He didn't show the fear I would expect from someone guilty of murder. Miss Marple paused for a moment, considering this. James wasn't acting the way we expected because he didn't see it as murder. To him, it was a necessary act of self-preservation. He thought the vicar had to be silenced for good. And he wasn't wrong in thinking that the vicar would have exposed him. Fawcett nodded slowly, as if he were just beginning to understand the complexities of what had transpired. So, you're saying James didn't realize the gravity of what he had done? He never thought about the consequences. Exactly, Miss Marple replied. James wasn't thinking in surety, terms of guilt or innocence. He was thinking of survival. The network his father was a part of didn't care about right or wrong. They only cared about protecting their interests. James, unfortunately, was caught in that world and acted out of fear. As Miss Marple spoke, a sudden realization dawned on her. Something about the pattern of events didn't sit right. There was still a missing piece. The letter that had been found in the church, the one detailing the vicar's fear of exposure, had been significant, but there was more to it. Turning toward Fawcett, Miss Marple spoke again. "Inspector, do you remember the letter the vicar had written before his death? The one that seemed to warn someone? The one that mentioned a secret that needed to be kept hidden?" Fawcett nodded. "Yes, but what does that have to do with this?" "I think the vicar was more than just a victim of circumstance," Miss Marple said, her voice taking on a new tone. "I believe he was actively working with someone else to expose the criminal activities. He wasn't simply protecting Mrs. Henshaw. He was using her as a pawn to get closer to the truth. And the letter, the one James found, wasn't meant for James at all. It was meant for someone else, someone who was trying to prevent him from exposing everything." Fawcett's eyes widened. "You mean there was someone else involved in the vicar's death?" Miss Marple's gaze was unwavering. "I do, and I think I know who it is." With the pieces of the puzzle finally falling into place, Miss Marple felt the stirrings of a final revelation. The vicar's death had been a calculated act, part of a larger plan that had been set in motion long before anyone had suspected. She turned to Mrs. Henshaw one final time, her voice gentle but resolute. "Mrs. Henshaw, the truth has come to light, and while it may not be easy to face, it's time for you to stop carrying this burden alone. James was not the only one responsible. There are others who need to be brought to justice." Chapter 10. The day had fallen into a quiet lull as Miss Marple, accompanied by Inspector Fawcett, made their way toward the village hall. The pieces of the puzzle had finally come together. James, Mrs. Henshaw, the vicar's letter, and the network of dangerous individuals. All of it pointed to one thing. There was more at stake than the simple tragedy of a murder. The village, for all its tranquility, had been hiding its own dark secrets. As they walked, Fawcett's brow furrowed, his thoughts clearly still racing. "You're certain about this, Miss Marple?" that the vicar wasn't just a victim, but a participant in his own death? "Yes, I'm certain," Miss Marple replied, her voice calm, though the undercurrent of resolve was unmistakable. The vicar knew more than anyone could have guessed. His death was part of a plan, one that involved not only his own protection, but also the safety of someone else. Fawcett looked skeptical, but didn't voice his doubts. The truth had been difficult to accept for him, and yet he knew, with Miss Marple's insight, that she had pieced together more than anyone else had seen. But if the vicar was helping expose this network, why would he have written that letter? And why would he have kept it hidden? Miss Marple paused, considering her words carefully. The letter wasn't just about the vicar's death. It was a message to someone who needed to know he was still working behind the scenes. Someone who could stop the network from going any further. He knew the danger he was in, but he also knew that by continuing his work, he could finally put an end to it. By the time they reached the village hall, it was nearing dusk. The building was bathed in a soft amber glow, and the occasional sound of voices carried through the air. The atmosphere in the village had shifted subtly, and Miss Marple could feel the weight of the anticipation in the air. People were talking, of course, about the vicar's death, but also about the strange rumours that had begun circulating about the people involved. Miss Marple entered the hall with Fawcett by her side, and the usual hum of conversation stopped as they stepped into the room. A group of villagers stood together in hushed conversation, but when they saw the inspector and Miss Marple, they quieted. It was clear to Miss Marple that the village had become tense, unsure of who to trust, and waiting for something, or someone, to reveal the truth. "Ladies and gentlemen," Miss Marple said, her voice steady as she turned to face the gathered crowd, "I believe it's time we bring the truth to light." The group, composed of familiar faces from the village, exchanged uneasy glances. Mrs. Jenkins was there, as was Mr. Dawson, the baker, and several other long-time villagers. Their reactions were mixed, but the unease in the room was palpable. "Miss Marple," Mr. Dawson said, stepping forward, his voice full of tension. "What is this about? What truth are you speaking of?" Miss Marple nodded gently, understanding his trepidation. "The truth about the vicar's death, Mr. Dawson, and the truth about the network of corruption that has been operating right under our noses." Gasps rippled through the crowd. A few exchanged anxious glances, and one of the women in the back pressed her hand to her mouth, visibly shaken. "Corruption," Fawcett repeated, stepping closer. "What are you implying, Miss Marple?" "I'm implying that the vicar's death was no accident, and that it was part of a much larger scheme," Miss Marple continued, her voice growing more resolute. "A scheme that involved not only James, but several others in this very room. And I believe we have one person here today who has been pulling the strings from behind the scenes." The crowd went still, all eyes turning toward Miss Marple. She looked around the room, letting the weight of her words settle in. "Mrs. Jenkins," she said finally, her gaze falling on the housekeeper. Mrs. Jenkins flinched as though struck by the words, but she quickly recovered, crossing her arms defensively. "What nonsense is this, Miss Marple? I don't know what you're talking about." "Perhaps you don't," Miss Marple said, her tone steady but filled with quiet conviction. "But I believe you know more than you've let on. You see, Mrs. Jenkins, your connection to the vicar wasn't just one of service. You were a key player in the very network that led to his death." Mrs. Jenkins's face drained of colour, and she took a step back. I don't know what you're saying. I've been nothing but loyal to this village." Miss Marple took a step toward her, her gaze unyielding. "Loyalty, Mrs. Jenkins, is a complex thing. You were the one who allowed the criminals to use the vicar's church as a cover. You were the one who allowed them to smuggle stolen goods under the guise of charity work. And you were the one who stood by while James, your own son, became involved in it all." The room fell into stunned silence, save for the sharp gasp that escaped Mrs. Jenkins's lips. For a moment, she seemed to crumple inwardly, her defences unravelling in the face of the truth. "I didn't have a choice," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I was trying to protect my son. I didn't want him to get caught in this world, but when I saw what he was doing, I knew it was too late. I couldn't stop it." Miss Marple shook her head, her voice softer now. "You didn't protect him, Mrs. Jenkins. You became a part of the very thing you feared, and when the vicar found out, he became the greatest threat to your safety. You knew that if the truth came out, your entire world would collapse. And so, in desperation, you made sure that he couldn't expose you. You took part in his death." Mrs. Jenkins's knees buckled, and she sank into a nearby chair, trembling. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her shoulders shaking as the reality of what had transpired finally overwhelmed her. "It wasn't supposed to go this far," she said, her voice cracking. "But I couldn't let it all fall apart. I couldn't lose him." Fawcett stepped forward, his face a mixture of disbelief and anger. "You'll be held accountable for this, Mrs. Jenkins. The law will have its due course." But Miss Marple's expression remained calm, almost distant. She had seen the pattern long before anyone else had. The truth had been woven into the fabric of the village, and now it was clear. Chapter 11. The tension in the village hall lingered long after Mrs. Jenkins was taken away by Fawcett's men. The air, which had once been thick with suspicion and unspoken fears, now hung in a heavy silence, broken only by the occasional murmur of those still processing the gravity of what had been revealed. Miss Marple stood at the front of the room to take her gaze calm and steady as she looked over the remaining villagers. They, too, were silent, their faces drawn and troubled, as if they had all been carrying some invisible burden that now, in the wake of the truth, seemed just a little bit lighter. Fawcett, who had remained silent for the most part, finally spoke as he approached Miss Marple. His earlier disbelief had been replaced by something quieter, more reflective. "I never imagined, I knew there were dark corners in a place like St. Mary's, but to think that it all came down to someone so close to the vicar. Someone who had been a part of his household." He trailed off, shaking his head. Miss Marple nodded. "It's always the quiet ones, Inspector. The ones who blend into the background, keep to themselves, people rarely look closely at them. But the truth often hides in plain sight, as it did here. Mrs. Jenkins was more involved than anyone could have guessed." Fawcett sighed, looking toward the door where the constables had just taken Mrs. Jenkins. "She was a mother, Miss Marple. A mother who wanted to protect her son from the very world he was already tangled in. That's the tragedy of it all, isn't it? She thought she could control the situation, keep James from falling too far into the darkness, but in the end she was the one who pushed him further." "Yes," Miss Marple replied softly, "and in her desperation, she became part of the very thing she sought to shield him from. But she wasn't the only one affected by these secrets. James, well, I imagine he never fully realized what his actions would bring." The inspector's face tightened. What about James now? What happens to him?" "James will have to face his own part in this," Miss Marple said, her tone gentle yet firm. "But I believe the punishment he faces won't be as severe as Mrs. Jenkins's. He was a pawn, influenced by those around him, manipulated by the very people who should have protected him. There's a great deal of tragedy in his life, Inspector, and while he is guilty, I don't think he will ever fully understand the weight of his choices." Fawcett nodded, his gaze distant. "It's strange. I've seen so many cases of crime in my time, but this feels different. It's the way everything connected, all those lives intertwined with deceit. It wasn't just a murder. It was a series of broken promises, damaged trust, and the slow unravelling of everything that was once held together." Miss Marple smiled faintly, the wisdom of age evident in her eyes. "Sometimes, Inspector, it isn't the crime itself that weighs on us. It's the stories we tell ourselves to justify our actions. Mrs. Jenkins thought she was protecting her son, but in the end, she only ensured his further entanglement. James, too, told himself he was doing what was necessary, but what he failed to realize was that those choices cost him everything." Fawcett looked down at the floor, deep in thought. "You're right. It's the stories. We convince ourselves that we're doing the right thing, even when it's the wrong thing. In the end, we only make things worse." As the two of them stood there, the reality of the situation slowly settled in. The mystery of the vicar's death had been solved, but there was still a lingering sadness. The village of St. Mary's would never be the same. The bonds that had held the community together had been tested, and some of them had frayed beyond repair. "I think it's time we let the village begin to heal, Inspector," Miss Marple said, her voice soft but decisive. "The truth has come out, and justice will be served. There is little more we can do." Fawcett nodded slowly. "You're right. It's over now. The pieces have all fallen into place." As they made their way outside, the evening air felt crisp, and for the first time in days, the village seemed to exhale, as if the collective tension had been released. Miss Marple, though tired from the mental strain of the investigation, felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. The truth had been uncovered. And while the road to that truth had been difficult, it had ultimately been worth it. The next few weeks passed in a blur of small-town life, resuming its pace. The village, though still dealing with the aftermath of Mrs. Jenkins's arrest, began to heal. Gossip lingered, of course, but with each passing day, the shadows of the past seemed to fade a little more. The vicar's memory, once overshadowed by the tragedy of his death, now found a more peaceful place in the hearts of the villagers. He had been a man who had tried to protect those he cared for, even when the cost was his own life. James, too, faced the consequences of his actions. His fate was still undecided, but there was a quiet hope that, given time, he might find a way to step out from the shadow of his past and begin anew. One afternoon, as Miss Marple sat by her window, her mind reflecting on the events that had unfolded, a knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. She stood, walking to answer it, and was greeted by Fawcett, who was holding a small bundle of papers. "Miss Marple," he began with a slight smile, "I just thought you'd like to know. The case is officially closed. The trial for Mrs. Jenkins has been set, and James will stand trial soon as well. It's all moving forward." "I'm glad to hear that, Inspector," Miss Marple said, her voice soft but sincere. "It's a strange thing, isn't it? How something that begins with such a terrible event can end with the promise of healing. The truth, though painful, has its own way of mending wounds." Fawcett nodded, looking down at the papers in his hands. It's never easy, but you've helped make sure that justice is served. Thank you, Miss Marple, for everything." Miss Marple smiled, a gentle, almost knowing smile. "It's my pleasure, Inspector. But you know, sometimes it's not just about solving the case. It's about understanding the people involved, their motivations, their fears. That's where the real answers lie." Fawcett smiled back, tipping his hat. "I'll remember that, Miss Marple." As the door closed behind him, Miss Marple stood for a moment, her gaze drifting to the village beyond. It had been a hard-won truth, but in the end, the answers had come. The village of St. Mary's could finally rest, knowing that justice had been done, even if the road to it had been a long and winding one. The mystery, as it always did, had come to an end. But the lessons learned about fear, guilt, and the cost of hidden secrets would stay with them all, quietly shaping their lives in ways they might never fully understand. Chapter 12. The days that followed had settled into a quiet rhythm, one Miss Marple had come to appreciate in her years of observing human nature. The village of St. Mary's, though touched by the tragic events that had unfolded, began to regain its familiar calm. The murmurs of gossip, once rampant, now softened into hushed conversations held in the corners of tea shops and around garden fences. Miss Marple sat in her armchair by the window, her fingers lightly tracing the edges of the embroidery she had begun long ago. Outside, the village was alive with the quiet hum of life, but within her there was a restless stirring. The mystery had been solved, justice had been served, but still she could not shake the feeling that something was left unsaid, some loose thread she had not yet fully understood. The knock on her door was gentle, yet Miss Marple's mind had already anticipated it. Inspector Fawcett entered, his usual stiff composure now softened by the weariness of a case well closed. He looked as if the burden of the investigation had finally lifted, but the flicker in his eyes told Miss Marple that there was still something unresolved. "Miss Marple," Fawcett greeted her, his voice quiet but steady. "I've come to give you the final update. Mrs. Jenkins's trial is set to begin next month. James is in a correctional facility for young offenders, and there's still some talk about his fate, but the law will take its course." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I'm glad to hear it's all coming to a conclusion, Inspector. Justice, however delayed, is still justice." He nodded, but his expression remained heavy. "Yes, but there's something I didn't tell you before. Something I've been thinking about. After all the pieces fell into place, there's one detail that keeps troubling me, and I think it's something you might have already seen." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "What do you mean?" "The letter," Fawcett said, his voice lowering slightly. "The one the vicar wrote, the one we thought was just a last warning, the one that mentioned the secret he had uncovered. It didn't just have anything to do with the criminal network. There was something else, hidden in that letter, Miss Marple. Something we overlooked." For a moment, Miss Marple said nothing, but her mind whirred through the events of the past weeks. The letter had always seemed important, but it wasn't until now that she realized its true weight. She had wondered at the time why the vicar had felt the need to protect some piece of information so desperately. And now, with Fawcett's words, it clicked. "What did you find, Inspector?" she asked quietly, her voice steady, yet filled with an undertone of expectation. Fawcett sighed, pulling a folded sheet of paper from his coat pocket. "When we examined the letter again, we found a name that had been crossed out, but was still legible. It was Mrs. Henshaw." Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat. Mrs. Henshaw. But she's already confessed. What more could the vicar have known? That's what I thought, Fawcett replied, his brow furrowing. But when we dug deeper into the vicar's personal papers, we found something else. The vicar had been planning to meet with someone connected to Mrs. Henshaw's past, someone who had more to gain from keeping her secret buried. Miss Marple's mind flashed to Mrs. Henshaw's earlier words, her confession about the hidden network. The secrets, the lies, all of it wrapped around a man whose name was now beginning to surface in her thoughts. The puzzle pieces had fit together so neatly, but there was always the possibility that something had slipped past her. "Who was he, Inspector?" Miss Marple asked, her voice now imbued with quiet urgency. Fawcett placed the paper on the table between them, and Miss Marple leaned forward. Her eyes scanned the name written on the paper. "It's a man named Edward Cartwright," Fawcett said, his voice tight. "He was an old associate of Mrs. Henshaw's late husband. A man with connections to the very network the vicar had uncovered. He's the one who pushed Mrs. Henshaw to the brink. And when the vicar found out about him, that's when everything spiraled out of control." Miss Marple's gaze never wavered from the paper. Edward Cartwright, his name was no stranger to her. She had noticed his occasional visits to the village, his quiet conversations with the vicar, but the connection had never seemed important at the time. Fawcett continued, his voice now filled with quiet realization. Cartwright was the one pulling the strings from the shadows. He had been using the vicar's charity work to launder money and move illicit goods. And when the vicar started getting too close to the truth, Cartwright panicked. He knew that if the vicar exposed him, everything would come crumbling down. Miss Marple nodded slowly, her mind racing through the final piece of the puzzle. "So it was Cartwright who orchestrated the vicar's death. Not Mrs. Jenkins, not James, but Cartwright, the hidden hand behind the scenes." "Yes," Fawcett said, his tone heavy, with regret. "He used Mrs. Henshaw's vulnerability, her fear, to manipulate her. And when the vicar began digging deeper, Cartwright knew he had no choice but to silence him." The two of them sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the truth settling in. Miss Marple had known all along that the mystery wasn't just about the vicar's death. It was about a much larger story of corruption, deceit, and the price of secrets kept too long. Cartwright's role had been the one element they hadn't yet fully uncovered. But now, with the truth revealed, the village of St. Mary's could begin to heal. "Cartwright will face justice, won't he?" Miss Marple asked softly. Fawcett nodded. "We've already sent a team to apprehend him. It's only a matter of time." Miss Marple stood, her movements slow but deliberate. The investigation had reached its end, but there was still one thing left to do. "Inspector, I believe we've solved the case, but I'm afraid the village will never quite be the same again," Miss Marple said, her voice calm but reflective. Fawcett nodded, looking out the window toward the village below. "No, Miss Marple, but sometimes the truth has a way of setting things right, even if it takes time." As the inspector left her cottage, Miss Marple stood by the window, gazing out at the village. The mystery had been unravelled, but the scars left by the secrets and lies would remain. Yet, in the quiet aftermath, there was peace. The truth, though painful, had given St. Mary's the chance it needed to move forward. And as always, Miss Marple knew that even in the smallest of villages, the truth was the most powerful force of all. Chapter 13. The evening of the trial marked the final chapter of the mystery that had unravelled the quiet village of St. Mary's. The court, filled with spectators, remained in a tense silence as the judge readied himself to pass judgment on Mrs. Jenkins. Her confession had sealed her fate, but it was James who stood at the centre of the room, his future uncertain. The truth of his actions had been laid bare, and while he had not been the mastermind, he had certainly played a part in the web of deceit that had entangled so many. Miss Marple sat near the back of the courtroom, her eyes soft and unblinking as she watched the proceedings unfold. There was no joy in seeing justice served, only the quiet satisfaction that the truth had triumphed. She had known all along that this was the only way it could end, but even she felt the weight of the finality as the gavel came down. Fawcett, who had joined Miss Marple, stood beside her, his usual stern demeanour softened by a hint of exhaustion. "It's over," he said, his voice low, as if speaking to himself. "But it still doesn't sit right, does it?" Miss Marple glanced at him, her expression pensive. "No, it doesn't. There are always consequences to the truths we uncover, Inspector. In this case, the consequences were lives, ruined, not just by one man, but by the choices of many. James will have to live with his guilt, but there's a part of me that believes he never truly understood what he was getting into." Fawcett nodded slowly. "I know what you mean. He was a pawn, Miss Marple, but he still made his own choices. The law has its way of dealing with that." The trial had been swift, but the whispers in the village had not ceased. Word of the network of smuggling, the involvement of powerful individuals, and the desperate lengths taken by those trying to protect their secrets spread like wildfire. Mrs. Jenkins, the seemingly mild-mannered housekeeper, had become the face of the scandal, and while some of the villagers pitied her, others held little sympathy. James, though, was a different matter. His involvement had been far less apparent, but his actions had nonetheless led to the vicar's death. The court had found him guilty, but the sentence had been mitigated by his age and the influence of others on his decisions. He was young, and the court had shown some leniency, sentencing him to a reform program instead of a lengthy prison term. Miss Marple had her own thoughts on the matter. She knew that the road to redemption for James would be long and fraught with inner turmoil. His youth and naivety had contributed to his involvement, but it was clear that his journey ahead would be one of introspection and, hopefully, growth. Whether or not he could escape the shadow of his father's legacy remained to be seen. The sun began to set, casting a soft orange glow over St. Mary's as the final verdicts were read aloud. The tension of the trial was finally over, but there was still an air of solemnity that hung over the village. Life would go on, of course. Life always did. But it would be different. People would never look at each other the same way again, not after the secrets that had been uncovered. Miss Marple left the courtroom with Fawcett at her side, the finality of the case settling into the quiet of the evening. "You've done good work, Inspector," Miss Marple said, her voice quiet but warm. "The village owes you more than it realizes." Fawcett smiled faintly, his eyes weary but satisfied. "It wasn't just me. You were the one who connected the dots. Without you, we would still be chasing shadows." Miss Marple chuckled softly. "I'm afraid I'm not as clever as you think, Inspector. The clues were all there. It's just a matter of knowing where to look and understanding the people behind them." As they walked down the village path, the weight of the case seemed to lift from Fawcett's shoulders, replaced by a quiet sense of relief. The village would heal in time, but the memory of the vicar, his attempts to protect his flock, and the darkness that had overtaken the village would remain. Miss Marple stopped at the edge of the village square, her gaze lingering on the familiar stone church. It had been the heart of St. Mary's for so long, and now it would serve as a reminder of what had been lost, and what had been found. "It's strange," Fawcett said, breaking the silence. "You can spend your whole life thinking you know a place, and then something like this happens, and you realize how little you really understand." Miss Marple smiled softly. "It's always been like that, Inspector. People wear masks, and it's only when something shakes them off that the truth becomes clear." Fawcett looked at her, a new understanding dawning in his eyes. "I suppose that's true. You've seen it all, haven't you, Miss Marple?" "Not all," Miss Marple replied with a gentle smile, her eyes twinkling, "but enough to know that truth has a way of finding its way to the surface even when people try to bury it." As the last light of the day faded, Miss Marple turned to leave, her pace slow and steady. She had seen the worst of human nature laid bare, but she had also seen the power of truth to heal, to change, and to restore. St. Mary's had its secrets, yes, but now it had the chance to move forward, to rebuild on the foundation of honesty. And as she walked home, Miss Marple knew that the village, like all villages, would eventually return to its rhythm, the shadows of the past slipping away into the quiet corners of history. But the lessons learned, the dangers of fear, the weight of guilt, and the price of secrets would linger, reminding everyone that even in the smallest of communities, the truth, no matter how difficult, would always find its way to the light.